Whenever I can, I like to go out painting trains. This is a train in Moscow. It turns out if you just bribe the guard, it's easy to paint a train in Russia. Well, of course, when I was taking the early pictures of graffiti, I had no idea what kind of impact they would have. I was taking them really for myself. And I could never have imagined that 40 years later, I'd be, traveling around and giving lectures about them. Anyway, I grew up in Baltimore, which is about 200 miles south of New York City. My dad had a camera store, and he gave me a camera when I was in nursery school. So this is a picture of me with my first camera and my father in the camera store. And he used to take me on what he called camera runs, basically walking around the city of Baltimore and looking for pictures to take. And I would say that's exactly what I still do. This is my first picture of graffiti. And I took it in 1962 when I was on an exchange program, and it was in Holland. And I just think it's kind of interesting to look back and see that I even thought this was something that was worth photographing. I'm sure most of you weren't even born in 1962. And so this is maybe one of my second pictures of graffiti, and it was taken during a summer internship with National Geographic. And for me, it's just interesting to see that I was looking at things that I saw on walls. I decided after that summer that I wanted to be a professional photographer, and I got a job with the New York Post. And that involved driving around the city to all 5 boroughs of New York. It was before the era of cell phones, but we had radios, and they could call us if there was some news assignment. But when there wasn't a news assignment, I was free to take pictures of anything that I could find. And if I could find something interesting, they would use it in the paper. So I began taking pictures of kids on the Lower East Side who were playing in creative ways. And one of the boys who had a pigeon coop, he's the upper left, showed me his little notebook and told me that he was practicing to put his name on a wall. And his name was He3, the bottom picture. And that was the first time that I understood the things that I was seeing on the wall, the graffiti on the wall, were actually names. I know everybody knows that now, but back then, people didn't know that. And so he said that he could introduce me to a king, and the king was Dondi, and he did. We went out to Brooklyn, and he introduced me to Dondi. And when I first met Dondi, he had clipped this article from the New York Post and pasted it into his black book, which is the book that graffiti writers use to practice, because it had a picture of a little girl on a swing with a wall with a tag that he had painted. And he recognized my name because my name was in the credit of this photograph. But I was amazed that I had never imagined that the scrawl that I would see on walls was something that could be identified. And it says CIA, that was the name of his crew, Crazy Inside Artists, inside meaning inside the subway cars. And he was so articulate that I decided I wanted to photograph graffiti. So he invited me to his apartment where a group of his friends were practicing in their black books, and I spent a whole afternoon taking pictures of them drawing. And in this picture, Dondi is the person holding the photo album. And those are photos that he took himself. And he explained to me that he would never paint a train unless he had a camera. And of course, the cameras that he had were cardboard cameras that he stole from like the drugstore. And this was my entree into graffiti because I could take better pictures. And so I was able to always give back pictures to the writers. They call themselves writers, the artists. That was my connection, because I'm not an artist myself. I'm a photographer. I'm a documentary photographer. I don't consider myself an artist. So after that day, I desperately wanted to go to the yards and see exactly how these trains were painted. And so he took me. We had to sneak into the yard, and this is maybe my most iconic photograph and my favorite. But it also allowed me to understand exactly how these trains were painted, because in one night, this is the train that he was painting that night. In one night, they could cover an entire car. And you can see in this car that the window where the conductor sat has been cleaned, but the rest of the car is in good condition. Probably only lasted 1 or 2 days before all the windows would be cleaned, and then after that, they would pull the car out of service. So it was really a challenge to take pictures of these whole cars. They're called top to bottom whole cars, before they were cleaned. And I began going up to the Bronx and spending hours and hours and hours just waiting in vacant lots for these trains to go by, in the hopes that I would see a freshly painted train. This one, for example, was painted by a couple, Duster and Lizzie. And the two cars had consecutive numbers, and so they would not be separated, so the two cars always ran together. This is a well-known in the graffiti world car by Futura, because he called it his break piece, because he was breaking away from the tradition of writing his name. And although he does have his tag, Futura, he didn't use large letters on the train. So these are just some of the photos. That's Lady Pink, one of the few female writers of that time. You can see that's a pink tag, Pink 82. And that's Mare and Pink in their high school bathroom. They both went to the High School of Art and Design, where they were learning art. And that's what their bathroom looked like. So about this time, just the early beginnings of hip-hop were happening, and I started going to some clubs. And on the left-hand side, you can see Doze breaking, and that's Keith Haring watching him. I think he's wearing a blue shirt. And I do credit Keith with kind of inspiring. There's a crossover between graffiti and street art, and Keith was friendly with a lot of graffiti writers, but he also was doing his own art on the street at the time. And I think a lot of other artists saw that. At the time, there was very little art on the street. And Keith, there was a big wall on Houston Street, and Keith painted it illegally, or that is without permission. And I would say this was the dawn of street art, maybe in the world. I mean, there were lots of examples that you can point to of a little bit of public art on outside. But I think this was really, this wall became well known and inspired a lot of artists to go out and paint themselves. Because at the time, if you were an artist in New York City and you wanted to get a gallery, for example, you had to take pictures of your art, and then you had to go to the gallery with a portfolio, and then you had to drop off your portfolio, and then they would tell you to pick it up maybe in 2 days, and you would pick it up, but you would never know whether they had actually looked at it or not. And this was a way you could just put your work out on the street. It's open to everybody. And after Keith painted this wall, there was a lot of street art happening. And this wall has now become a famous wall in New York. And it was, Marty is my nickname. It was painted for me 10 years ago on my 70th birthday. And it's still being painted today. I mean, it's every few months. Okay, so the few differences between street art and graffiti. A lot of people sort of think they think they're the same thing. I don't think they're the same thing at all. Graffiti pieces are all about letters. And okay, there might be a character thrown in, and in this case, the character is the I. But if there aren't letters, it's not considered really graffiti style. And in fact, a lot of graffiti writers don't want to call it graffiti anymore. They want to call it style writing, which is a pretty appropriate term. Whereas street art is generally about images. And of course, in a case like this, you can see there had to be a big lift for the street artists, and it had to be a permission wall. Underneath, the graffiti writers have been able to write as high as they could reach. That's why it only goes up that far. So sometimes, this is a wall by Franco Fasoli, Jazz, who you have two big, beautiful walls here in Oostende, but it's been gone over by a graffiti writer. So you have street art and graffiti together. And sometimes there's a collaboration, like this is Shepard Fairey and Cope. Shepard Fairey's very well-known, maybe the most well-known street artist, and Cope too, very well-known graffiti writer, collaborating on a wall. Cope bought the same colors as Shepard used, Shepard's colors, so that the colors would match. However, this is an illegal collaboration of a Shepard wall with a graffiti writer. So you see you've got the images and the letters. And of course, a lot of street artists came out of the graffiti world. And Oostende from Brazil often writes graffiti. And in Wynwood, they had two adjacent walls. And one wall they did their very recognizable figures, and the other wall they did letter graffiti with the names of all their friends. This was the paint that was available back in the day, a very limited color selection for graffiti writers. And this is the paint available today. Hundreds and hundreds of different colors in every possible shade, probably 20 shades of gray, and produced specifically for street art and graffiti. So back in the day, you had, if you wanted a big marker, you probably had to make it yourself, and you made it from a shoe polish bottle, like Woody did. And if you needed different kinds of caps to make wide spray or narrow spray, you had to find out like which oven cleaner in the supermarket had that kind of spray, and then you would steal the cap off of the spray from the supermarket. Now, they manufacture amazing kinds of markers specifically for graffiti and caps. These are fat caps and skinny caps that you can buy in stores. And pretty much every country has stores devoted to graffiti supplies. These three pictures are from Russia. Like, who could imagine that Russia would have graffiti stores and their own graffiti paint? I have done some collaborations with two different paint companies. The two the cans that you see here, the top can were 3 cans from a photograph of mine of cops on a train, and the bottom can is called Martha Marine. I chose the color, and you can still buy it. So there's some countries, though, that don't have access to these kinds of materials, and that particularly interests me when I'm photographing. I always like to find different tools and techniques. This is in Mexico, and they know how to mix colors can to can, like 2 different spray cans. They can, you can see the picture on the left. They can mix them, and on the right, the boxes contain a lot of sponges, which they use instead of brushes because they said their brushes are too expensive. So here's Jazz. You have, or Franco, you have 2 absolutely gorgeous walls here in Oostende that he painted. But in this picture, he's using tar and paint thinner to paint because he said that in Argentina, which is where he's from, there are neighborhoods where that is what kids are painting with because they can't afford any paint. And I just thought that was really interesting. This is what he was painting. And he also is very ingenious when it comes to his brushes. He made these two brushes. He attached a little brush and a big brush and is painting with them on the end of a pole. Although graffiti writers generally paint with spray cans, the street artists often paint with rollers and brushes on the ends of long poles. This is ours. And what I like about photographing street art is that I get to see this art being produced. Because once the art is finished, you have no idea how it was painted. And sometimes the way it was painted is like so difficult and so ingenious, and you just can't tell. So the only way to see it is in that small window of time, and that's happening right now here in Oostende. So I suggest you walk around and watch some walls being painted. Here's Maya Hayek. She usually uses a roller, and you have a Maya Hayek wall here. Your wall is in the Ukrainian colors, because Maya is Ukrainian or Ukrainian heritage. And ever since the war began with Russia, she decided only to paint in yellow and blue. She's a very well-known artist, and the wall on the bottom here is that same wall that Keith Haring painted, the Houston wall, which is a very prestigious wall to be allowed to paint that wall. It's a curated wall. It's owned by a family, and she's one of the few women who have painted that wall. So some artists use very tiny brushes to paint big walls. And this is a wall by Alexis Diaz, and he used those little brushes to paint this whole wall. You had a wall by Alexis right behind here, right? This wall. Sadly, it is no longer here. And that's another reason why I like to photograph street art and graffiti, because it's ephemeral. And usually, or almost, maybe always, the photographs are going to last longer than the work itself. So I feel like it's a method of historic preservation, and I feel that it's useful to have these photographs because it's an international street art movement, but it's not as if these walls are going to be in a museum for the next 100 years. So these are just some tools and techniques. Some artists like to use fire extinguishers filled with paint. This is L with a fire extinguisher, and other examples. The Fumacaca crew in Peru had invented it's not a fire extinguisher, but you can make it yourself, and they had a little booklet to show you how to make it, and you can pump it up with a bicycle pump, and it works like a fire extinguisher. This is Krink, who has his own company of markers and fire extinguishers, and his work is always drippy. And this is Katsu, who with a fire extinguisher illegally, in broad daylight, painted on the side of the Museum of Contemporary Art during a street art show, completely shocking the curators. But in fact, it was probably the most honest piece of street art of all. And I'm very sorry that I was there in California, but I wasn't there when he did it. And I'm very sorry that I missed the action, but I got the aftermath. And Katsu is now experimenting with spray cans attached to drones. So I don't know if you can see, there is a drone attached to that spray can. Imagine being able to fly to top of a tall building and paint something. Street artists use a lot of stencils, something that graffiti artists don't generally use. This is C215, and you have a very nice C215 piece here in Oostende. This is Aiko, who does stencils. This is the Houston wall. And of course, Banksy does stencils. and Joan. Yay. Yeah. Which, I mean, I was so happy to be able to see him at work. You know, that was, to me, it's a real privilege to be able to watch an artist at work, even because probably artists don't even want to be watched while they're working. So, and to be able to photograph him, it's a lot of fun. Wheat pasting is another technique used by street artists and not by graffiti writers. This is Swoon. Of course, there's JR. And basically, street artists can use anything. This is Oleg, who uses yarn, and Add Fuel, who makes tiles that have patterns on them that are totally unlike any real patterns. And you have a great wall by Add Fuel in Oostende. So, I mean, I've been traveling all over the world for street art to places that you would never have imagined street art and graffiti would ever get to. This is in Senegal. This is in Tahiti. The Tourist Bureau of Tahiti actually funded graffiti events. I mean, would you imagine that anybody would want to go to Tahiti to see graffiti? It just seems. And this is a big wall painted by Seth. And they use it, this is an actual stamp used by the government of Tahiti with Seth's wall on it. So last year I went to Congo. They have some amazing artists and graffiti writers. And this is a wall by Ever. You have a wall by Ever. But the sad thing about a lot of these street art walls is that they just don't last. And this is, you know, it only lasted a couple of years, and then it's gone. So again, you need to take pictures. I just was in London for Beyond the Streets, and this is something I never could have imagined would be, it's 40 years later, here are the same graffiti writers now exhibiting at the prestigious Saatchi Gallery, painting. This is a wall painted by Lady Pink. And this is Urban Nation in Berlin, where the exterior was painted by Eiko from my photographs. So each of these people are in my photographs. And I'm starting a street art and graffiti library at Urban Nation. So if anybody has any books they want to donate, I'm trying to collect everything. People are calling this the biggest art movement in the history of the world, which I didn't make that up, and I think that could be true, and I think it's important to preserve the literature because that's going to disappear. I'm still very interested in illegal graffiti, and I worked a lot with the One Up crew. Whenever I can, I like to go out painting trains. This is a train in Moscow. It turns out if you just bribe the guard, it's easy to paint a train in Russia. This is in Soweto. And this is in, anybody recognize it? Belgium. Yes. And lots of trains in Belgium. So I was here in 2021, and I went train painting in broad daylight in Belgium. Nobody stopped us. It was, and that's that.